I am a father of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and one of their favorite things to do when we can, when the weather permits, is to go to the beach. They love the ocean. For my 2-year-old, his first time at the ocean, at the beach, was just this past summer. And I distinctly remember walking out on the sand with him, and he was gripping my hand tightly. He'd never seen anything like it in person before, but as soon as he saw the water in his 2-year-old mind, he had his mind made up that as long as he was holding Daddy's hand, he could take on the world, he could take on the seas. And so he just made a beeline, gripping my hand, made a beeline for the water, completely unaware of the fact that he doesn't know how to swim and that the ocean is actually a vast and sometimes dangerous place. I think in some ways we can all relate that when we are young, before all of the difficulty and pain of life comes our way, we have this sort of exuberance and this belief that as long as we are holding on to the hand of one who loves us and cares for us, we can take on anything, the stormiest seas that may come our way. But life beats us up. We experience pain and we experience loss. We grow exhausted and weary because of the weight and the burden that we carry. And soon enough, pessimism, realism, and most insidiously, doubt begins to creep in. For the last couple of weeks, we have been journeying through this series called The Questions of Jesus, and we've been exploring specific questions in the Gospels that Jesus asks in order to help us shape a renewed and stronger faith in Him. And today we arrive at a question that confronts and speaks incredible hope into the midst of our doubt. It's a story that many of us know. It's the story of Jesus walking on water in Matthew chapter 14. I want to set up the story before I read the story to you. Before the story we are about to read, Jesus and His disciples have just been hit with the incredibly painful news that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been executed. And so Jesus and his disciples decide to find a solitary place, presumably so that they can grieve and rest and mourn together. But instead of finding rest and a space to grieve, the crowds follow them. And it says that Jesus has compassion on the crowds. And so instead of resting, instead of grieving, He begins to teach them and eventually miraculously feeds them, thousands of people, with just a couple pieces of fish and a few loaves of bread. And the disciples help make this happen by serving the food, literally to thousands of people. And finally, after all of this, Matthew 14, verses 22 to 26, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to the other side while He dismissed the crowd. And after He had dismissed them, He went up on a mountainside by Himself to pray. And later that night, He was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw Him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. So let's think about the story one more time. The disciples are in a boat because Jesus had told them to go on ahead of Him across the lake. They're actually crossing what is called the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a lake, but it's a large lake, about 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. And if you read the details of the story in the original language, this takes place. The storm hits the boat right around between 3 o'clock in the morning and dawn. So it's in the middle of the night, in the pitch black of night. And then in their fear, they see a shadowy figure on the water walking toward them, and they think it's a ghost. What's happening here? Why the fear? Remember, the disciples have just experienced incredible pain and loss. And then they haven't even been able to grieve the pain and the loss. They ended up serving thousands of people food. They're exhausted. And so, of course, inevitably, doubt begins to creep in. And then in their doubt, in their fear, in their anxiety, Jesus speaks this truth As the disciples are grieving from pain and loss, as they're exhausted in the middle of this lake, hit with the storm, fearful and afraid, Jesus says in Matthew 14:27, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. That phrase, "it is I," in the original language, Koine Greek, is actually just two words, ego eimi. And the best way to translate those two words, the literal translation, ego eimi, is I am. So what Jesus says is, take courage, I am, don't be afraid. Now that phrase, I am, if you've been a Christian or if you've read the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it should sound familiar to you because it is a common phrase in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and in particular, in Exodus chapter 3. Remember the story of Moses before he leads the Israelites out of Egypt? He encounters God at a burning bush, and he asks God, "God, what is your name? When I go to Egypt to rescue people, who do I tell them sent me?" And God gives Moses his divine name. He says, I am. I am is the name of God. Jesus doesn't just walk on water and say, "Hey, take courage, it's me, Jesus, don't be afraid." No, what Jesus says is, take courage, I am, don't be afraid. This is actually a declaration on Jesus' part to tell his disciples, in the midst of your doubt, in the midst of your fear, in the midst of the darkness and the storm, God himself is in your midst. I am. It's a fascinating thought that Matthew, Jesus' biographer, the writer of this gospel, places this phrase, I am, literally right smack dab in the middle of his story. Most scholars would agree, depending on which manuscript you look at, that those words, ego eimi, I am, find themselves quite literally at the very center of Matthew's gospel. Matthew is a literary genius. This is not an accident. He is pointing us at the apex of his biography of Jesus. He points us to this great truth. Jesus is not just a great teacher or philosopher or famous Jewish rabbi or healer or even prophet. Jesus is the great I am, God himself. Now, despite Jesus' incredible declaration as he walks on the water that he is the great I am, the disciples are still overwhelmed with doubt, understandably so. Remember, just like many of us in our lives, they have experienced pain and loss, they're exhausted, and they're yet again faced with another storm in their life, quite literally a storm. And then when Jesus declares, I am, it's not convincing enough. Look at the story. Matthew 14:28. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Now remember, the other 11 disciples are still in the boat. "Come," Jesus said. And then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he, Peter, saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," Jesus said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." That is the question for us today. Why did you doubt? Why did Peter, despite all that he had seen, all of the miracles, all of the signs, all of the wonders, all of Jesus' declarations, and in fact, Jesus' emphatic declaration out on the water a moments before that he is the great I am, why did Peter doubt? Why do we doubt? Despite all that so many of us have seen God do in our lives and in the lives of people we know. Despite all that we have seen Jesus lead us through, again, in our lives as well as in the world and in our church, despite all that God has done and continues to do, why do we doubt? We doubt because we've experienced pain and loss. We doubt because so many of us are hurting and we're exhausted by so much that is happening, both in the world and in our lives. We doubt because we're tired and we're weary and the storms of life continue to come endlessly and ceaselessly. But I want us to notice something, because often doubt gets a really bad rap. And in fact, Simon Peter gets a really bad rap in this story. It's like, oh, he was doubtful. Why didn't he believe? He saw Jesus walking on the water. Why did he doubt? He doubted again because he had experienced pain, loss, he was exhausted, and he saw the storms all around him. It's the same reason why we doubt today. But I want you to hear this. If you are doubtful, if you feel faithless and hopeless today, Jesus does not wait to rescue you after you've overcome your doubt. Jesus rescues you in the midst of your doubt. What does verse 31 remind us? It says that immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught Peter. Jesus rescues Peter from the storm before he addresses the doubt. Again, your doubt does not keep Jesus from rescuing you. Jesus rescues us from our doubt and in the midst of our doubt. And if you feel doubtless, if you feel hopeless, if you feel a little bit faithless today, I want to encourage you with this truth. Your rescue is not dependent upon the strength or fragility of your faith, as small as it may be. Your rescue is dependent upon the one, Jesus, the great I Am, who rescues you. As the writer Tim Keller reminds us, it is not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. I don't know what sorts of storms you're going through, but chances are you're going through something. This is just the nature of life. Life is never always easy, always pleasant, always peaceful. The reality of human experience is that we go through storms in life. And when those storms come, it is natural and it is normal and it is expected that even for followers of Jesus, that we would experience immense amounts of doubt. Wondering if we'll ever get through this, wondering if resolution will ever come, wondering if the storms will ever die down. It's a fascinating thought about this story that we've been exploring today. It tells us that although Jesus is up on the mountainside and the disciples were already a considerable distance out in the middle of the lake, remember, in the pitch black of night before electricity, where there was no light, it says that Jesus saw them. In fact, in another version of this story in the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus could see the disciples straining at the oars. Even when you cannot see Jesus, the great I Am, he sees you. In the darkness and in the chaotic waters of the storms you are experiencing, even when it seems like Jesus is distant, no matter how far he may seem, he sees you. Remember, I said earlier that verse, Matthew 14:27, when Jesus says to them, "Take courage, it is I am, don't be afraid." Remember, I told you that verse is right smack dab in the very center of Matthew's gospel. Matthew is pointing us to that truth with big, bright, blinking lights. That phrase, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." In fact, the entire phrase is worded in the original language not as a complete sentence, but as three emphatic statements. The literal translation of Matthew 14:27 is, "Take courage, I am, no fear." Jesus doesn't even speak in a complete sentence. He just commands with emphasis and with power. In the midst of their doubt, in the midst of their storm, he says, take courage, I am, no fear. I also told you that that phrase, I am, is taken from Exodus chapter 3. What the overwhelming majority of scholars agree on is that Matthew, as Jesus' biographer, is intending to present a very particular motif. We don't have time to get into all the details, but basically Matthew is presenting Jesus as a new Moses. And what he means by that is that just as God used Moses to rescue people in the Exodus out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land, freedom and flourishing, Jesus has now come to rescue all people out of slavery to sin and death into freedom and flourishing and eternal life, both now and forever. And so in Matthew, there are constant allusions back to the Exodus story. And anytime in Matthew you read like an ocean or sea or water story, like the story we're in today, Matthew is very clearly pointing us to the central water story in the Exodus. When the Israelites are standing before the Red Sea and they have this ocean before them and the Egyptian army is coming after them. And so the ocean is before them and the army is behind them and they don't know what to do, literally between a rock and a hard place. And God parts the waters. That's what this story of Jesus walking on the water would have reminded Matthew's original audience of. This beach that I'm standing on here today was the last beach we came to at the end of summer with our kids. And I distinctly remember that day standing before the ocean behind me, holding my son's hand. And as my son was trying to run into the water, I had this strange thought. I thought, what would it have been like as a father in the Exodus story, standing before the ocean with the enemies creeping up behind us? I thought, what would I have done if I was a father holding my son's hand in that moment? And the thought came to me, without hesitation, I would have put my son on my back and I would have swam as far and as long as I could, knowing that at some point my body would give out and we would be lost at sea. This is often how we feel when doubt creeps in. We feel like we are between a rock and a hard place, with enemies behind us and an impossible sea before us. But just like the Exodus story reminds us, that unlike you and I, we have a God, a heavenly Father, who has the strength to carry us across any sea, any stormy waters. No matter the depth of our doubt, God can part the waters and bring us safely to the other side. And in Jesus, the great I am, who declares, take courage, I am, no fear, what we have is a reminder that Jesus can not only part the waters, he can walk above the waters. That despite our doubt and in the midst of our doubt, even when we cannot see him, he sees us. And if we could cling to his hand like little boys cling to the hands of their fathers, we would begin to realize that in spite of our doubt, despite all of the fear and anxiety we face, anything is possible when Jesus goes before us. And so regardless of the doubt you are facing, right in the middle of the doubt that you are experiencing now, I would encourage you to hear the words of Jesus declaring to you today, take courage, I am, no fear. Take courage, I am, no fear. Take courage, I am, no fear.